Berlin, February 14, 1945. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's master of propaganda, sat alone in his study. His pen trembled as he wrote a single name, Patton. For 12 years, he had told Germany that Americans were weak, soft, mongrelized, incapable of real warfare. But German soldiers retreating from France told a different story, not of brutality, but of abundance. Endless tanks, unlimited ammunition, chocolate bars in every American ration while German troops starved. We knew we had lost when we saw their rations, one captured sergeant said. How do you defeat a nation with that kind of abundance? The name became a curse whispered in foxholes. Even saying it aloud seemed to summon doom. This is the story of what Goebbels wrote when the lies finally broke, when one American general destroyed everything the Third Reich believed about itself. The propaganda minister sat alone in his dim study on the Wilhelmplatz, the leather of his chair creaking beneath the weight of a man who had once commanded the will of millions. Outside, the city groaned under the pressure of Allied bombers, distant thunder that rolled through the night like the breath of an approaching storm. Joseph Goebbels, architect of the Third Reich's mythologies, dipped his pen into ink that seemed darker than usual, the nib scratching across the page of his private diary with a sound like fingernails on stone. The name he wrote, Patton, appeared in letters that trembled slightly, as if the hand itself had recoiled from forming the syllables. In that single word, written in the failing light of a regime that had promised 1,000 years, lay the confession of a nation's deepest fear. This was not supposed to happen, not to them, not to the armies that had rolled through Poland in weeks, that had brought France to its knees in 42 days, that had pushed to the gates of Moscow and made the earth itself seem to bend beneath their treads. The German war machine had been built on the mythology of invincibility, on the carefully constructed narrative that Goebbels himself had spun from whole cloth and parade ground spectacle, a story of supermen, of destiny written in blood and iron, of a warrior race that would reshape the world in its image. For years, that story had held. For years, German mothers had sent their sons eastward and westward, with pride swelling in their chests, confident that the fatherland's steel would never break, that its generals were touched by some divine strategic genius, that its cause was righteous and unstoppable. And then came Patton. Not the idea of him at first, but the reality. The brutal, undeniable, relentless reality of a man who shattered every assumption Goebbels had built his empire upon. To understand what Goebbels wrote in those desperate February days, one must first understand what he had believed, what all of them had believed about the American enemy. In the carefully orchestrated propaganda broadcasts that poured from Berlin's radio towers throughout the 1930s and into the war's early years, America had been depicted as weak, decadent, mongrelized, a nation of cowards and capitalists, too soft from luxury to fight, too fractured by democracy's endless arguments to sustain a coherent military will. The German General Staff had studied reports about American training exercises before the war and had laughed at what they saw. Recruits training with wooden rifles, an army that numbered barely more than 100,000 men, tanks that looked like they belonged in the last war. Not this one. They make automobiles and motion pictures, German officers had told each other over schnapps in officers' clubs, from Krakow to Calais. Not soldiers. Even Hitler himself had dismissed the American fighting capacity. In his mind, shaped by crude racial theories and wishful thinking, the United States was a polyglot chaos. Blacks and Jews and Italians and Irish all jumbled together without the pure Aryan blood that supposedly made German soldiers superior. How could such a mongrel nation produce warriors? How could a people raised on jazz music and Hollywood films understand the brutal necessities of total war? The propaganda posters plastered across occupied Europe showed American soldiers as gangsters with Tommy guns, or as fat capitalists smoking cigars while European children starved. Radio broadcasts mocked President Roosevelt as a cripple manipulated by Jewish advisors, mocked the American boys who would supposedly crumble the first time they faced the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers heading west to man the Atlantic Wall in 1944 had been told they were facing an inferior enemy, one that would break and run the moment real fighting began. It was a beautiful lie, and for a while, it sustained them. But lies, no matter how beautifully constructed, cannot stop tank treads. They cannot deflect artillery shells. They cannot hold ground against an enemy that has learned not just how to fight, but how to wage industrial-scale warfare with a ferocity born not of ideology, but of terrible, focused competence. The German soldiers who first encountered Patton's Third Army in the summer of 1944, as it broke out from Normandy and began its furious drive across France. Discovered something that shattered every assumption they had carried into battle. They discovered that the Americans did not fight like they had been told Americans would fight. There was no hesitation, no softness, no collapse in the face of hardship. Instead, there was something that terrified them far more than brutality. There was abundance. Abundance of ammunition that poured from American guns in volumes that seemed impossible, turning entire landscapes into moonscapes of craters and shattered trees. Abundance of tanks, not just a few here and there, but entire columns of Shermans that stretched beyond the horizon, more tanks than German, observers could count, rolling forward with a mechanical inevitability that felt less like warfare and more like industrial process. Abundance of aircraft that owned the skies so completely that German soldiers learned to move only at night, to hide in forests and cellars during the day, to feel the earth tremble with each passing squadron of Thunderbolts and Mustangs, but most of all, abundance of will. The German troops retreating before Patton's advance sent reports back to headquarters that their commanders initially refused to believe. The Americans were not stopping to rest. They were not pausing to consolidate gains, not waiting for supply lines to catch up, not giving the Wehrmacht time to establish new defensive positions. Instead, Patton's columns moved with a speed and aggression that seemed inhuman. 20, 30, sometimes 40 miles in a single day, grinding forward even when their tanks ran low on fuel, pushing exhausted infantry beyond what German doctrine said was the limit of human endurance. They fight like machines, one German lieutenant wrote in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence. But machines that never tire, never stop, never give us a moment to breathe. Another report, this one from a panzer commander who had fought on the Eastern Front and thought he had seen the worst war could offer, described something more disturbing than the American firepower. They do not fear death the way we were told they would. They come forward even under heavy fire, not with the fanaticism of the Russians, but with something colder, professional, businesslike. They kill us the way one might complete a job on an assembly line, efficiently, without passion or mercy. And at the center of this American storm was Patton himself, a figure who seemed designed to mock everything the Nazi leadership had believed about their enemies. George S. Patton Jr. was not supposed to exist, not in the world that Goebbels had constructed. He was old by combat standards, nearly 60 when he led the Third Army across Europe, an age when most warriors had long since retired to teach or plan or simply remember. He commanded an army that included black soldiers and Jewish soldiers and immigrants from every corner of the earth. The very mongrelization that Nazi ideology claimed would produce only weakness. He led men who had been civilians just years before, factory workers and farmers, shopkeepers and students, not the professional warriors that Germany had spent decades breeding and training. And yet, he won. Again and again and again, he won. Not through superior numbers alone, though he had those. Not through better technology alone, though American industry provided that too. He won through something the German general staff had not accounted for. Leadership that combined classical military genius with a uniquely American kind of audacity. He moved faster than doctrine said was possible. He attacked when conventional. Wisdom said he should defend. He pursued defeated enemies with a relentlessness that gave them no time to regroup, no space to establish new lines, no hope that the onslaught would ever end. The German high command began tracking his movements with the kind of obsessive attention usually reserved for enemy armies 10 times his size. Radio intercepts of American communications that mentioned Patton were immediately forwarded to Berlin. Intelligence officers pored over maps, trying to predict where his Third Army would strike next, knowing that wherever Patton attacked, the line would break. Defensive positions that might have held against other American commanders were hastily abandoned when word spread that Patton was coming, that his tanks had been spotted on the roads leading toward their sector. The name itself became a weapon, something Goebbels had not anticipated, could not counter with propaganda broadcasts or carefully edited newsreels. German soldiers whispered it in their foxholes like a curse, a harbinger of the doom rolling toward them from the west. Radio operators monitoring Allied frequencies would hear Patton mentioned and immediately reported up the chain of command, watching as their officers' faces went pale. Even the SS divisions, the fanatical true believers who had been told they were the master race's finest warriors, withdrew rather than face Patton's advance head-on, choosing to preserve their strength for defensive battles where they might have some chance, rather than be ground to pieces by the American war machine at its most efficient. "We do not fear the Americans," captured German officer told his interrogators in late 1944. "We fear him." and we fear what he represents. What Patton represented was the collapse of every myth that had sustained the Third Reich's war effort. The myth of Aryan superiority dissolved in the face of an American general who outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought the supposedly brilliant German officer corps. The myth of American weakness evaporated as Patton's Third Army liberated more territory more quickly than any Allied force in the European theater, covering distances in weeks that had taken German armies months during their years of conquest. The myth that democracy made nations soft and indecisive shattered against the reality of a citizen army that fought with discipline, courage, and a terrible competence that came not from ideology, but from something deeper, a sense that they were fighting for something worth fighting for, not merely fighting because a dictator commanded it. In the winter of 1944-45, as Patton's army smashed through the German counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge, executing a 90-degree pivot of his entire Third Army in the middle of a Belgian winter, moving nearly 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles over icy roads to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne in less than 72 hours, the German propaganda apparatus simply stopped trying to explain him. How could you tell your people that the enemy they had been assured was inferior had just accomplished a military maneuver that German commanders privately admitted was impossible? How could you maintain the fiction of supremacy when Patton did, in 3 days, what the German General Staff said could not be done in 3 weeks? You couldn't. So instead, you fell silent. Or you wrote in your private diary the thoughts you dared not speak aloud. Joseph Goebbels had always understood power through narrative. He had risen to prominence not through military genius or administrative competence, but through his ability to tell stories that made people believe in the Führer, believe in the cause, believe that Germany's destiny was manifest and unstoppable. His entire career had been built on controlling the story, on shaping perception, on ensuring that the German people saw reality through the lens he provided. When German armies had marched into Paris, he had crafted the newsreels that made it seem like destiny unfolding. When the Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Russia, he had written the speeches that promised final victory was just beyond the horizon. But what could he say about Patton? What narrative could contain this American general who moved too fast, hit too hard, and won too often? In his diary entries from early 1945, documents that would not be discovered until after the war's end, after Goebbels himself had chosen suicide over capture, the propaganda minister revealed something he could never have admitted in public: fear. Not the fear of losing, though by February 1945, even the most fanatical Nazi knew the war was lost. No, this was something more personal, more ideological. It was the fear that everything he had built his worldview upon had been a lie. Patton moves across Germany like a force of nature, Goebbels wrote on February 14th, his handwriting growing more erratic as the entry continued. Our generals speak of him in whispers, as if even saying his name aloud might summon him to their sectors of the front. The troops we send against him do not simply retreat, they collapse. Not through cowardice, but through recognition that they face an enemy who cannot be stopped by will alone, who cannot be defeated by ideology or belief in racial destiny. He continued, "We told our people that Americans were weak, that their society had made them soft, that their mixed blood had robbed them of warrior spirit. And yet this man, this American, demonstrates a military genius that rivals anything our vaunted general staff has produced. Worse, he does so while commanding an army of those very mongrels we assured our people could never fight effectively. What does it mean when the mongrels defeat the master race? What does it say about our fundamental premises?" These were not questions Goebbels could ask publicly. To voice such doubts would be treason, would be the ultimate betrayal of the ideology he had spent 2 decades promoting. But in the privacy of his study, as Soviet armies closed in from the east and Patton's Third Army drove deeper into Germany from the west, he could not escape the terrifying implications of what he was witnessing. The Americans were not supposed to be able to do this. They were too divided, too democratic, too comfortable in their capitalist prosperity to develop the hardness necessary for total war. Their soldiers were supposed to be boys playing at warfare, not men who could match and exceed the professional brutality of the Wehrmacht. Their generals were supposed to be political appointees and industrial managers, not commanders who could execute maneuvers that left German staff officers shaking their heads in reluctant admiration. And yet they could, and yet they did. And in doing so, They destroyed not just German armies, but German certainties. There was something else in those diary entries, something that went beyond military analysis or ideological crisis. There was a quality of almost childlike bewilderment, the confusion of a man whose entire understanding of the world had been built on premises that reality was now methodically destroying. Goebbels wrote about the reports flooding into Berlin from German troops who had been captured by Patton's forces, reports that described not the brutality the prisoners had been conditioned to expect, but something far more disturbing to Nazi ideology: competence mixed with casualness. American soldiers who treated German prisoners not with hatred or revenge, but with the bored efficiency of workers processing materials on an assembly line. POWs who were fed from the Americans' abundant rations. Rations that included meat and chocolate and coffee in quantities that German frontline troops hadn't seen in years. Camps where German officers watched in confusion as black American soldiers guarded them with the same authority as white soldiers, as Jewish soldiers wore the uniform of the conquering army. They do not even hate us properly, Goebbels noted with something approaching despair. They fight us the way one might eliminate a pest infestation, distasteful but necessary work. There is no passion in it, no recognition of us as enemies worthy of respect. They simply want it done so they can go home. This is more insulting than hatred would be. This was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. The German military tradition was built on concepts of honor, of warrior respect between adversaries, of war as a proving ground for masculine virtue. German soldiers had expected that if they fought well, if they demonstrated courage and tactical skill, they would earn the respect even of their enemies. That was how it had worked on the Eastern Front, where German and Soviet armies recognized in each other a certain terrible kinship, a shared willingness to endure the worst that modern warfare could inflict. But the Americans, and Patton most of all, denied them even that consolation. Patton fought them not as worthy adversaries in some grand historical drama, but as obstacles to be removed, efficiently, quickly, with the minimum expenditure of American lives and the maximum application of American material. When his Third Army broke through German lines, Patton did not pause to savor the victory or honor the defeated. He simply kept moving, already focused on the next objective, the next city to liberate, the next German formation to destroy. There was something deeply American in this approach, pragmatic, results-oriented, impatient with ceremony or tradition when there was work to be done. It was the attitude of a nation built by people who had crossed oceans to escape old hierarchy, who had conquered a continent through determination and innovation, who had built the world's most productive economy by focusing on what worked rather than what aristocratic tradition said was proper. And it was exactly this quality that made Patton so terrifying to the German leadership. He wasn't trying to prove German theories wrong through some grand ideological counterstatement. He was simply winning over and over in ways that made German theories irrelevant. By March 1945, when Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine River, executing a crossing so swift and successful that he famously stopped in the middle of the bridge to urinate into the river, a gesture of contempt that would have been impossible to imagine from any German general. Goebbels had largely stopped writing about military strategy in his diary. The entries from those final weeks of the Reich are surreal, detached, alternating between desperate propaganda plans that would never be implemented and personal reflections on the collapse of everything he had believed. On March 23rd, the day after Patton's crossing, Goebbels wrote, "He makes a circus of our defeat. Perhaps that is the American way, to reduce even war to entertainment, to spectacle, or perhaps it is something worse. The confidence of a man who knows he has already won, who can afford gestures of contempt because the outcome is no longer in doubt." Our soldiers see these reports. We cannot suppress them all, and they understand what it means. It means we are not fighting an enemy who respects us enough to hate us. We are being dismissed. There is almost a plaintive quality to these later entries, the tone of a man searching for some framework, some narrative that might make sense of what was happening. Goebbels had built his career on the power of stories to shape reality, on the conviction that perception could triumph over fact if the story was compelling enough. But he was learning, too late, that some realities are too large, too undeniable, to be shaped by narrative. You could tell German soldiers that Americans were soft, but when those soldiers encountered Patton's tanks, rolling toward them with unlimited ammunition and air support, the story collapsed. You could broadcast propaganda about American decadence, but when German prisoners were fed better by their captors than they had been by their own army, The propaganda became a bitter joke. The story had failed. And for a man like Goebbels, whose entire identity was wrapped up in his ability to control narrative, this failure was more than military. It was existential. There was one symbol that appeared repeatedly in the accounts of German soldiers who encountered American forces in 1944 and 1945. One image that seemed to encapsulate everything that terrified and demoralized them: American rations, K rations, and C rations, distributed to every American soldier. Individual packages containing not just food, but cigarettes, candy, coffee, matches, toilet paper. German troops who captured American supply dumps would find warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with these individual rations, enough to feed entire armies for months. They would open the small cardboard boxes and find portions that a German frontline soldier might not see in a week: canned meat, crackers, chocolate bars, powdered lemon drink, chewing gum. It seemed impossible. How could a nation at war, fighting across 2 oceans, maintaining military operations on multiple continents, still provide each individual soldier with his own personal supply of chocolate? The Germans had been rationing food at home since before the war began. Their soldiers in the field often subsisted on black bread and thin soup. Meat was a luxury. Coffee was a memory. And yet here were the Americans, handing out candy bars like they were nothing, equipping every soldier with more food in his personal pack than a German infantry squad might receive in a day. We knew we had lost when we saw their rations, one German sergeant told American interrogators after his capture. Not because of the tanks or the planes, we had expected those, but the food, the cigarettes, the coffee. Every single man had more than we could imagine. It meant their nation was so wealthy, so powerful, that they could afford to feed their soldiers like kings while fighting a war on the other side of the world. How do you defeat a nation with that kind of abundance? You cannot outlast them. You cannot make them suffer enough to quit. They have too much. They are too much. This abundance, material, yes, but also abundance of will, of confidence, of the casual certainty that they would win, because winning was simply what Americans did, became the psychological weapon that no amount of German propaganda could counter. Goebbels could craft speeches about German resilience and martial virtue, but those speeches rang hollow when spoken to soldiers who knew that the enemy they faced had eaten chocolate for breakfast and would eat it again for dinner. Who knew that American soldiers complained about the monotony of their rations, while German soldiers dreamed of having anything to complain about. Patton understood this instinctively. He insisted that his troops be supplied as well as possible, not out of sentiment, but because he knew that well-fed, confident soldiers fought better than hungry, desperate ones. He pushed his supply officers to keep ammunition and fuel flowing forward, but also coffee and cigarettes, medical supplies, and mail from home. He created an army that functioned not through fear or ideology, but through competence and purpose. Men who fought well because they were treated well, because they believed in what they were fighting for, and because they knew their nation had given them every possible advantage. This was American abundance, deployed as strategy, and against it, German ideology shattered like glass. In his final diary entry about Patton, written on April 12, 1945, as American and Soviet forces closed the ring around Berlin, Goebbels abandoned any pretense of analysis or propaganda. The entry reads almost like a confession. I have spent 12 years telling the German people that they were superior, that their blood and culture destined them for mastery, that the democratic nations were weak and unworthy. I crafted this narrative with every tool of persuasion I possessed, and the people believed. They believed because they wanted to believe, because it made them feel powerful, chosen, special. And now that lie is burning around us. Patton, this American, this representative of everything we claimed was inferior, has carved through our armies like they were paper, not through some miracle of warfare, but through simple, brutal competence. His soldiers are not supermen. They are ordinary men from ordinary places, given excellent equipment and led by a commander who understands war as engineering, as a problem to be solved through application of resources and will. They do not need ideology. They have abundance instead. They do not need racial superiority. They have industrial capacity instead. They do not need destiny. They have democracy, a system that, for all our mockery, has proven capable of organizing entire continents for war while maintaining the illusion, perhaps even the reality, that the individual soldier matters, that he fights for something beyond mere obedience. We are defeated by this, and the defeat is absolute not just militarily but philosophically. They have proven that our fundamental premises were wrong. Patton has proven it every day with every mile his army advances. And I, who spent my life in service to those premises, must now face the possibility, no, the certainty that everything I built was founded on lies that could not withstand contact with truth. 3 weeks after writing those words, with Soviet soldiers fighting their way through Berlin's streets and Patton's Third Army deep inside German territory, Joseph Goebbels would poison his 6 children and then take his own life. The Reich he had served, the narrative he had crafted, and the ideology he had promoted would not survive him by more than days. But Patton's name would endure, not just in American memory, but in German memory too, a reminder of the war they had lost, and more painfully, the reasons they had lost it. When elderly German veterans would gather in the decades after the war, they would speak of the Eastern Front with horror, of the British with respect, of the French resistance with anger, but they would speak of Patton with something different, a kind of grudging awe mixed with the bitter recognition that he had represented everything their ideology had claimed could not exist. An American, a Democrat, a commander of mongrels, and yet undefeated. The winter rain fell on the Rhineland that April, washing away the last traces of winter snow and the last illusions of German invincibility. In field headquarters across what remained of the Third Reich, officers studied maps that showed Patton's positions advancing daily, unstoppable as a tide. And in homes across Germany, parents listened to the footsteps of returning sons, those lucky enough to return, and heard in their stories the same name, spoken sometimes with respect, sometimes with fear, but always with recognition that they had faced something their training had not prepared them for, an enemy who was supposed to be weak, proving instead to be overwhelming. The chocolate bars in American rations, the endless columns of Sherman tanks, the casual confidence of soldiers who knew their nation would never run out of ammunition or will, and above it all, the name that even Goebbels could not erase from German consciousness through propaganda or will. Patton. In the end, the minister of propaganda had written the truth, at least in the privacy of his diary. Written it because he could no longer deny what every German soldier already knew. The Americans had not won merely through numbers or industrial might, though they had those in abundance. They had won because they represented something the Third Reich had not been able to comprehend. That strength could come from diversity, that confidence could be built on truth rather than lies, that ordinary men fighting for democratic ideals could defeat supposedly superior warriors fighting for mythology. Goebbels' diary would be found in the ruins of Berlin, its pages testament to the collapse not just of armies, but of ideologies. And on those pages, the name Patton appeared again and again, becoming not just a military footnote, but a symbol of everything the Nazi state had claimed was impossible and yet had proven to be inevitable. That is what happens when myths meet reality. The myths do not adapt, they do not survive, they simply break, and the breaking in the end is absolute.